All right, so my name is Sierra Mano. I'm the Public Programs and Education Manager at the Museum of Art and Design at Miami-Dade College. And tonight we're continuing our A River Runs Through It series with A River Runs Through It Part 2, the Tequestas, Florida's First Peoples, presented by the Miami-Dade College Special Collections and the Kislak Center at the Freedom Tower. So I'd like to remind everybody that all of our talks will be posted online on our video channel at ModeMDC and also on our website at modemdc.org under the Freedom Tower and then the Kislak Center section. So I'd like to introduce Dr. Carol Damian of the Kislak Center now. Carol's an art historian, former professor of art history at Florida International University, and Carol is a former director and chief curator of the Patricia and Philip Frost Art Museum. Carol's currently the curator of the Kislak Center, and she's part of our Miami-Dade College Special Collections house at the Freedom Tower, and as well as the Chapel of La Merced Colonial Collection at Corpus Christi in Miami. So we're so happy to have Carol tonight with Bob Carr. So Carol, if you'd like to take it from here.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody, for being here. Our Kislak collection, as you know, the Freedom Tower is presently closed. So we are doing virtual programs to try to keep the name of the Kislak Center out in the public. And also it gives us an opportunity to look at different objects and themes with the scholars. So it really has worked out very well. The Kislak collection is about the ancient Americas. So our topics have been about the ancient world and peoples as well. Tonight, I am joined by Arthur Dunkelman, who is the curator of the Kislak collection at the University of Miami Special Collections. And he was the founding curator of the Kislak collection at the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C. So he has been very instrumental in the installations of both the Freedom Tower and of the University of Miami collections, and is quite an expert on the objects. So it is my pleasure to introduce Robert Carr, Bob Carr, who is going to talk about the Tequesta tonight. He is the co-founder and the director, presently the director of the Archaeological and Historical Conservancy. And he served as its director since 1999. He has worked as an archaeologist and the state of Florida's Division of Historic Resources and with the National Park Service. He was Miami-Dade County's first archaeologist and became the county's historic preservation director. He is also going to talk about the Miami Circle, which is, I think, probably one of his favorite subjects. And certainly those of us living in Miami have been very curious about the Miami Circle and what it represents. So, Bob, I will turn it over to you. Thank you so much for being here.
Well, thank you. This is a real pleasure to join all of you tonight. One of my favorite subjects, the Miami River, the Tequesta, it's a great combination. And I wanted to start by talking a little bit about my own personal journey in finding the Miami River. My family, like a lot of the families that were part of Miami in the 1950s, came from other parts of the United States. My family originally came from Philadelphia and upstate New York. And they decided they were going to Florida. This was after World War II. And for my father, it was a great event. For my mother, it was a lesser event because she was not happy about the big change. But once finding ourselves in Miami, we ended up living very close to the Miami River. We lived in what is now Little Havana and Riverside area, close to 7th Avenue. Those of you who know Miami, near Southwest 8th Street, at that time now Calle Ocho. And what started this quest is my own curiosity. And I remember in 7th grade, raising my hand, and my teacher, Miss Murphy, the question I had said, Miss Murphy, I said, who were the first people in Miami? Who were the first people? And she said, the Seminoles. The Seminoles were the first. And of course, she's a teacher. I took that as being gospel, so to speak. And I said, well, that's really interesting that there were Native Americans here. Of course, back then you would say Indians. There were Indians here. And that whole idea was dispelled by one of my classmates who became one of my best friends. His name was Mark Green. And about a week later, he came into the class. It was show and tell, and he has a shoebox, and it's filled with artifacts made out of shell, pieces of bone, animal bone, a beautiful stone celt. And I said, where did you find this? He said, well, I found it on the Miami River, but I said, where on the river? And he said, oh, I'm not going to tell you. He says, it's a secret site. I said, well, I mean, it took 3 days worth of my lunch money to convince him to share this sacred knowledge with me. And we became fast friends. And as summer approached, he took me to that site. And there on the bank of the river, on the south bank of the river, was a small elevation, a mound that was about 2.5 feet tall, and it was about 15 feet wide. And there is the place where he was finding this material. So we, not knowing any better, started digging there with our trowels, but we started reading about archaeology. We got books out of the library, and we wanted to do it right. So we worked very carefully. We didn't dig a giant hole in the middle. We actually started at the edge and started working in. We kept notes, we did drawings, and we started to find all kinds of interesting things. And as the summer approached, it was almost a week before school was going to start, and we knew that the secret of the mound was about to be found because we were near the center of the mound. We knew everything that we had to find that was going to be of interest and important was going to be in the center. We excavated the center, and with our trowels, we started hearing the clunk of metal, which didn't make any sense. And as we brushed away, we uncovered what it turned out to be the rusted hulk of a Model T Ford. So the mound was actually a mound created from a dredge, picking up the Model T Ford from the Miami River and putting it up on the bank. So the good news is we ended up not destroying an important Indian mound, but it was the first place that we found any artifacts. And it wasn't only a few months later that I took a shortcut across that grassy lawn, which, by the way, at that time was the YMCA baseball field. And as I took that shortcut, I went to a place where there was a canopy of tropical almond trees growing, a grove, and the soil was very wet, and it was filled with crab holes from these large land crabs. And I was shocked to look down at the edge of the hole, and there were artifacts, pieces of pottery, just laying around the hole. The crabs were going down into the soils and bringing these up as part of excavating and cleaning out their holes. So here I discovered another part of the site that I didn't know about. And interestingly enough, how life finds itself to make sense on all important parts. Today, we're working on the Brickell site exactly at the place where those crabs dug up that hole, which is the 444 Brickell parcel. And now we're uncovering what is, without a doubt, one of the most important memories in terms of the material assemblage of the Tequesta. Only about 400 feet from the Miami Circle, we are making discoveries that had never been found or heard of before. These things will all be part of the story that we tell when the work is over, but what I'm going to share with you tonight is some of what we have found in the past, some of the things you already have heard about, like the Miami Circle and some of those discoveries, and why it makes a difference. Because aside from the fact of having a curiosity and finding yourself going in the right direction for your life, who, by the way, my father was strongly encouraging me to be an engineer, and this idea, I had this crazy idea of being an archaeologist. He poo-pooed. He said, are you kidding? He said, we're going to make a living. That's not going to make any sense, he told me. I went to school. I was majoring in education and history and English. And finally, I got to the point, I said, there may be reincarnation, but I'm only going to remember one life at a time. So I'm going to do what I want. So I got away from those other subjects, and I went into archaeology, and I discovered myself doing this kind of work in different parts of Florida and eventually all over the world, and then finally back to Miami, which was really like a godsend to be able to come back and do the work. So with that said, I'm going to go ahead and get this started. Let's see. Oh, yeah, right there. Okay.
So while you're while you're doing that, Bob, Arthur and I may have some questions and interrupt you occasionally. So, you know, to keep it sort of like a little bit of a conversation. I've already got questions.
Okay.
You just started. You're probably going to answer them, but go ahead. Sorry.
So part of what is you're going to see is this idea, the complexity of Tequesta culture, the first people, is completely contradictory to what we've been told and what we've been taught in our school system, and from what we could read from the Spanish, who were the first unintended ethnographers of the Tequesta. And we'll talk more about that as we go along. This is the mouth of the Miami River looking south. That is the Brickell House that was built in 1909. It was originally, there was a trading post there. And that arrow is pointing at where the Miami Circle eventually was uncovered, so very close to that historic house. And this is the mouth as presented by this map, where you can actually see the various sites. The sites in Florida all have prefixes with letters that represent the county. In this case, DA stands for Dade County. And 11, for example, is the 11th site recorded in Miami or in Dade County. And 11 is the big portion of the site of the town of Tequesta on the north side of the river, and DA 12 is on the south side of the river. And you can see where that DA 14, it's actually one of the mounds, is really large, unusual burial mound. And other sites that we ended up excavating over the last many years, since starting in 2002. So we began this archaeological data collecting 20 years ago, when development finally caught up with that part of Miami, because those lots, interestingly enough, were parking lots. And there, thanks to the fact that the city of Miami and the county has an ordinance that protects archaeological sites, that means that they're not all preserved, but they have to be documented before you can build on them. We were able to start creating a record and assemble materials that would become a study collection for scholars for years and years to come. This is looking at the north side of the river. That's the Royal Palm Hotel on the left side. And all of that sweeping green space at that time were the grounds of the Royal Palm Hotel, but was actually the center focus of the town of Tequesta, as described by the Spanish, always alluding and describing the town being on the north side of the river and never mentioning the south side. And that's an interesting fact that we'll talk about later as to why it seemed to be only on the north side in the 16th century. Unfortunately, this is a photo documentation of a postcard, but it was a photo done of the building of the Royal Palm Hotel, and that is the great burial mound that was there, located at what is now Northeast 3rd Street near Biscayne Boulevard. The workers are carrying and carting that dirt around, getting it out of there, destroying it, finding hundreds and hundreds of human remains. Unfortunately, although some were reburied underneath one of the foundations of an early Miami building, and they sold the property to property owners without telling them they had buried the remains there. But the skulls, crania, many of them were collected in barrels and sold at a shop on Flagler Street to tourists for $5 a skull. And I discovered later, I thought the hotel, the Royal Palm Hotel, was actually right on where that mound was, and that mound happened to be on the footprint, but that turned out not to be the case. This is actually just north of the hotel to the northeast. And the reason Flagler had it destroyed is he said it was blocking the view of the tourists that were coming. So he had it leveled. This is the infamous Miami Circle discovered on the south side of the river. This was an extraordinary surprise, because up until this time, no structure associated with the Tequesta or any South Florida Indians had ever been uncovered. And the bigger part of the surprise was that the footprint of this structure was memorialized by the fact that these holes were cut into the rock to allow the structure to be built. That you see those kind of long-shaped holes, those are basins, and within the basins, you're going to see that they put post holes. So this was something totally unexpected. It created a tremendous controversy amongst archaeologists, amongst the public, and it was part of the struggle to preserve this site, because there were many very well-renowned archaeologists who absolutely did not believe that this was something prehistoric. One archaeologist in particular, and Jerry Milanich, Dr. Milanich from the University of Florida, went public and he put out national articles as to that this was a sewer system. Fortunately, it was proven wrong, and you can see here a close-up of the features that we recorded, the basin and the circular holes where the wooden posts were put in it. So this is very much like almost like a modern construction foundation where the holes are large enough to support what would have been a wooden post holding up what apparently would have been a very important building, either the cacique or the chief's house, or possibly a council house, something very unusual, very special. And you can see the number of post holes, every one of them excavated carefully, recorded, something, again, that none of us had ever seen before. This was certainly the most unusual feature cut into the rock. This was on the cardinal direction of the eastern hole, the most eastern hole, which would have been more aligned with the rising sun. And it's unlike all of the other holes because it's in the shape of an eye. And it looks almost like a pupil inside the middle. Now, again, I'm giving you a interpretation that is based on what I believe it is an intentional representation of an eye, because an eye is a very important symbol with Southeastern and Eastern tribes. The eye, I will talk more about the eye, but we see it showing up in other motifs and locations as well. And again, feel free if you have any questions as we're talking, you can interrupt me. But here is what we call midden. Midden is the part of the site, a area of habitation where refuse from daily life, the subsistence of the Tequesta was so focused on maritime subsistence regarding taking advantage of what was in the river, Biscayne Bay, the barrier islands, as well as the interior Everglades. So the Miami River was essentially the I-95 of its day. It was connecting Biscayne Bay with the Everglades. And at that time, the Everglades was at present day 29th Avenue. And so it was not that far a distance to get there. And I always liked the story when Marjorie Stoneman Douglas wrote the book on the Everglades River of Grass. She was the first approached by the publisher to do a book. It was a book on the rivers of America. And they said, what about the Miami River? And she said, oh, no, that's no river. This is more important, the Everglades. And of course, she was right. And although the Miami River is not the Cadillac of rivers, it is an essential element of lifeways and cultural habitation and subsistence. It's the ultimate location for survival in terms of having a successful culture because of its proximity to all the waterways and because of the fact that it was high and dry. You know, but the other myth that I'd like to dispel is a lot of people have the misconception that the city of Miami was a modern creation of Flagler and other developers, and they came here and they did all this dredging and filling, and essentially the city is just this underlain with fill everywhere, and that never had its own natural high elevation, which of course it did. It was called the Atlantic Coastal Ridge, and it was an important element of how prehistoric people were able to live here because they had a very high elevation. And wherever there was a waterway, whether it was a river like the Miami River, the Little River, or Snake, they call it Snake Creek, which is where Reynolds Park is today, Arch Creek, all of these waterways traversed the Atlantic Coastal Ridge and provided connections to the Everglades. And therefore, these waterways were so important. And the city of Miami, even historically, found its anchor in the river in terms of how it first grew. But we know now from the archaeological remains that the first people were probably here at the mouth of the river 5,000 to 10,000 years ago. Although through radiocarbon dating, we know for sure that they were here at least 1000 BC. But from other parts of Miami-Dade County, we see that earlier record, including the Cutler Fossil Site in South Dade County. This is typical of the pottery sherds. This is the bowls that the Tequesta were using for cooking and for storage. This has a very interesting design. It's a, it looks like it's a check stamp, but it's a particular kind of check stamp. It's called Deptford check stamp. Up until now, it was found only in northern Florida. And this was the first time it was recorded in large numbers, and it was found in the circle. And why is that important? Because it indicated that there was a tremendous trade activity going on with other parts of Florida, and as we soon found out, with other parts of the southeastern United States. So again, giving reinforcement to the idea that the circle is a very important and a vital focal point of not just trade, but probably power in terms of the chief or cacique living there. There's a larger shirt of pottery, and this pottery dates back to roughly about 400 AD. And the site itself, as it turns out, dates to about 400 AD. So predating the arrival of Europeans by at least 1,200 years, we see a subsistence and a community far more developed than anything the Spanish described as huts, savages, heathens, these kinds of terms that completely diminished the effects of this culture in terms of who these people were and how successful they were in their adaptation to their water world of sorts. And I think that is an important thing for all of us to know, that we're looking at a people who were very effective in not just survival, but making a contribution to the culture of prehistory and developing and surviving through all of the skills that evolved through living in this kind of environment. These are plummets, possibly weights, but there's some speculation some of the better ones were actually used as ornaments or perhaps for manufacturing nets. This is one of the features that allowed us to know that the Miami Circle was a special place. That big, large white block you see is the foundation of the Brickell Apartments. So the Brickell Apartments was actually built on top of the Miami Circle in 1949, I believe. And rather than destroying it, it actually preserved it because they put fill over the site and built their building. After the 1980s, construction in downtown Miami didn't look anything like this. After 1980s, everything was dug down 10 feet, 15 feet, everything was destroyed. But up until the 1950s, lots of sites were preserved as a result of the kinds of construction techniques that were being used at that time. So what you're looking at, if you look on the left and right side of that, you see a lot of small bones. Those are vertebrae, and those are the vertebrae of a shark, a 6-foot shark that was deliberately interred as a ceremonial offering. It's facing and aligned exactly east-west, in line with the eye that was cut, and eventually we found other ceremonial offerings, including a bottlenose dolphin's cranium and a sea turtle carapace. Everything was aligned east-west. Now I'm taking us to the north side of the river. This is called Met Square. And this aerial view, likewise, they the developer had to allow us to do the archaeological recovery here. You're looking at the bedrock with all the tremendous amount of solution holes. These are natural holes in the rock that allowed not only things to be collected in terms of things lost, but was the support system for the post holes and the other structures that we found. So just as what we found on the south side, we began to find more of these circular structures on the north side. This is one of our test areas that we're looking at, and what's so unusual is this orange colored soil. The dark soil above is what we describe as midden. It's filled with shell, filled with artifacts, and all of it was redeposited as a result of the construction of the Royal Palm Hotel, where they leveled that ground and put the ground out to create the gardens of the Royal Palm Hotel. And the orange soil below was fill placed there during Fort Dallas from 1838 to 1858. And that fill was placed there deliberately by the Army to give a surface for the soldiers to put their tents in, because the rock beneath it was just too rough and difficult to deal with it. Now, what's interesting is where did they get the soil? This orange soil only comes out of large, deep solution holes. It's a very old paleo type sediment that probably is at least 8,000 to 10,000 years old and was originally Sahara desert dust that was in the air and gathered all through southern Florida at some point in time during the Paleo-Indian period. But this soil came out of a large solution hole. We don't know where. The soldiers were put to work taking it out. And the reason we know what it is because it was filled with Army artifacts from the 1830s and 40s, as well as Native American remains. The Tequesta skeletal elements were all through that soil because they had dug out a cemetery to get the soil to create this. So these soldiers were sleeping on top of the remains of these ancient people, probably not even knowing it, most of them. And you can see the modern versus the old, always an interesting combination there. Again, we're looking at Met Square, we're looking north at Southeast 3rd Street. This is one of the circles that we uncovered, somewhat similar to the Miami Circle on the south side. And in the foreground, those foundations are actually the foundations of the Royal Palm Hotel, which are preserved and are now preserved as part of a proposed exhibit that is underneath the new Met Square building. And you're looking down at the bedrock, a little hard to see the post holes, but there's a PVC pipe, white pipe, so you can kind of see the circle. It's a bullseye, concentric circle. And that too dated between 400 and 700 AD. And here you can clearly see an arc of the post holes aligned across the rock. And here you really see it well. Most of the post hole features are roughly 35 to 38 feet in diameter. There's some that are smaller, but that seems to be a size that we saw as a pattern consistently. We found a total of 11 circles or remnant circles of this village on the north side of the river. And this just shows you the mapping that we would do, where we would draw in every post hole, which is in blue. So we had a record of the site before it was destroyed, or in this case, actually was part of the mediation to preserve some part of the site as part of the developmental permit. There's a great final picture of it. And concentric circle probably represents multiple structures, that the smaller one might have been the first structure and the outer holes probably represent a later rebuilding of that structure, making it somewhat larger. Close up of the post holes, most of them are average about 20 centimeters in diameter. You might say, well, how did they, they didn't have metal tools. How did they dig these holes? Well, we did an experiment and we took one of the shell tools and we found that you could fasten the shell tool to a wooden handle. And in about 10 minutes, you could actually start breaking into the rock. And once you got through what's known as the duracrust, the hard outer surface, you actually could dig very rapidly. So they were able to do this with precision and with exactness. And many of the holes are paired, suggesting an actual renovation or repair where one post is decayed or something happens, then they just put the post up right next to it to secure the wall. Some of our total station and scanning equipment. And you can see where these various numbered circles, these are the circles within the block 3, that's Met Square. And then on the right, you can see we did a scan and the colors are representing elevational changes, and the yellow being the higher elevation and the more orange areas are deeper. And here again, the same thing, you can see it's getting higher as you get away from the river and it gets lower as you go towards Biscayne Bay. This is we called it the Royal Palm Circle, the one you've been looking at. So a lot of different versions of these drawings and scans. So again, so we have a record and we can interpret exactly what was happening here. This is comparing the Miami Circle, which is on the left, and the Royal Palm Circle on the right. very similar in size, but very different in the construction techniques. The Miami Circle, and what caused the controversy about its antiquity was that rectangle on the bottom, because that is a septic tank, allowing the drainage of the septic effluent going into that and into a pipe that actually at that time went out to Biscayne Bay. At that time, there was no laws or ordinances protecting the water. So all of these buildings along the river were dumping sewage directly into the river and into the bay. And just showing the comparisons of the circles and giving you a better idea of the relationship of the properties. The Brickell property originally, I'm sure you heard from Paul George, he is well versed in the history. You can see the Royal Palm Hotel. The best locations you could ever have for living in Miami, both sides of the Miami River. And of course, that was the focal point of the town of Tequesta. And just showing you some of the historic artifacts that were found to give you an idea of this continuum, to think that that parcel represented at least 3,000 years of Miami's history.
Bob, I have a question for you. The strategic location of the settlement between, with almost direct access to the Everglades, the bay, and the ocean, must have offered a very rich environment for food and other resources. How unusual is that in terms of the rest of the archaeological communities that are known going north, on the East Coast?
That's a good question. And it's an important facet of the development of the Tequesta and why they were so successful as a culture and able to build these communities the way they did. And it's not unusual that Native Americans, of course, would pick areas near rivers and so forth. So that's not unusual in itself. What is unusual is that this location has a myriad of diverse environments, and this diversity of environments provided a diversity of resources from inland upland sites to, as I mentioned earlier, the Everglades, the Bay. So this tremendous variety of fauna and plant life is the reason that the Tequesta and the Calusa on the west coast of Florida are amongst the only groups in North America to develop a socially stratified, complex society without the advent of agriculture. And that was lost on the Spanish who came here. They saw that the absence of agriculture was an indication of savagery. And they did not understand that that was just not necessary, that it wasn't that the Tequesta wasn't exposed to the opportunity for maize agriculture by the woodland or Mississippian period. It was just not compelling enough to go through that labor when they had such a plentiful environment that they could work.
Okay,
This is the part of the columns from the Royal Palm Hotel, and I'm showing you this to show that this Met Square site is quite extraordinary in how much was preserved there. And this is the actual steps beneath the going down into the basement of a portion of an under portion of the Royal Palm Hotel, still preserved. And actually, we recovered the steps, and they're going to be interpreted. We've asked them to be interpreted as part of the public access to the Met Square walkway that they're going to be completing soon. And again, looking at inside the building, the Royal Palm is on the right, and the bedrock, the native limestone, which is actually a oolitic limestone, is on the left. Again, showing the various maps. These are the keys from the Royal Palm Hotel. They actually are room keys. We uncovered the key room was still there with all the keys. We found hundreds of keys. This one was not in the key room because you can see it's in good condition. That's because I found it on eBay. And this is a Seminole glass bead that was preserved because the Seminoles were obviously visiting this site. Many of them were taken as prisoners by the soldiers at Fort Dallas. So the Seminoles were on this site as well. And these were all trade beads. They were manufactured in Europe, but they were very important to native people because they always had a tradition of beads, all of them made out of shell, out of stone or bone. But when the Europeans came and introduced the glass beads, they became very, very popular. This shows the alignment of the circles, and the green lines are walkways. So we found out many of the circles actually were connected by causeways, elevated causeways. So we think the town of Tequesta was an elevated town, that it was not built on top of that difficult rock, but rather it was actually on top of wooden scaffolding and platforming. If you want to get an idea of what it may look like, you can go on the internet and look under Orinoco River villages, prehistoric villages or Indian villages, and you'll see examples of what we think the town of Tequesta probably looked like.
How many people?
Well, the site is fairly large, but that doesn't mean it was fully occupied at any one time. In fact, I suspect there was no more than 300 to 500 people at any one time, maybe less. And the reason the site is so large, because if you're throwing a lot of shell refuse onto the ground, that it's going to smell really badly soon. So I have a feeling maybe things got moved around a bit as a result of that. And I mentioned earlier that the south side of the river was occupied at the same time as the north side, but we have discovered through radiocarbon dating and through the artifacts that almost all of the south side of the river was abandoned by 1200 AD. And we don't know the reason why. We don't know if it was suddenly regarded as a more sacred part of their complex. We don't know if it was possibly as a result of the influence of Mississippian culture, which swept through Eastern North America around 1200 AD, where there became a very definite idea of how sacred structures and settlements had to be, that the inception of temple mounds and burial mounds, and the importance of water as a separator between the living and the dead, the idea of water as a barrier from the ghost, because the Tequesta and other Native Americans really did believe that there was no distinction between what we call supernatural and natural. The idea of a ghost was part of a continuum of life, because they did believe in the soul. And the Spanish priests recorded that the Tequesta believed that there were three souls: one in your eye, one in your shadow, and your reflection in the water. And that would possibly explain why there are mortuary burials underwater all through Florida, in sinkholes and solution holes and ponds, because the water was not only the barrier between life and death, and it was the place that we all had to go through as part of this transformation. And so I think water was very, very important in terms of the cosmology and part of the idea of the soul. And here in this particular slide, you see the alignments, the boardwalks that I mentioned earlier. This is an aerial view looking down the white circles. You can see on the right, lower right, that's the Royal Palm Circle. That's now in a room in the Met Square building. They have not opened it in terms of, they haven't interpreted, they haven't done really anything towards doing anything to make it publicly accessible. And on the extreme top left is what we call the South Circle, Southwest Circle, and that's also preserved. Some of you may have looked and seen it. It's open, and it's, again, not curated, it's not interpreted yet. And we're marking all of the circles and the alignments. And just that note, seeing life return to these downtown lots, this dragonfly landing there, I thought was a good reminder of what this used to be like. And of course, I have to say something about the books I've done. If you're really interested, Digging Miami was published by University of Florida Press. So I believe it might still be available through University Presses of Florida or perhaps Amazon. And the other book I did, The Everglades, the images of the Everglades. So anybody really interested will find more information there. I'll close by saying sometimes the truth is best told by fiction. And I've just completed a book called The Python Conspiracy, which is the story of the Miami Circle and the introduction of pythons into the Everglades. Combination of magical realism, definite real things that happen about the Miami Circle and other things. So I'm working on getting that published, but I'll use this now as a good closer, and any questions, please ask. Oh, I need to get off this.
Thank you so much. We do have some good questions for you. I'll read the first one. Based on your extensive experience, how do you distinguish between a shell midden and a shell mound?
Well, that's a good question. A mound generally is a constructed elevation. So the mound is actually intentionally built. Usually it's associated with mortuary or religious or ceremonial purposes. A midden could also be elevated, but it's not intentionally made. It's a elevation created as a result of refuse being thrown down onto the ground and just building up through time.
Thank you so much. We've got the next one. Your book, Digging Miami, was published a decade ago. What is the biggest discovery during the last decade that you most wish would have been discovered earlier, so it could have been included in your book?
Well, a way to answer that question is we have found so much that really what it necessitates is another book rather than wishing for what I didn't find. But we've made some really interesting discoveries recently, and I think it will change our knowledge quite a bit in terms of what was found. We've actually found now preserved wooden artifacts, cordage from nets. We are finding seeds that'll give us an insight into the ethnobotany, what plants were being harvested and picked in the wild. We're even finding preserved insect parts. So we're going to have a full picture of this whole world in the next several years.
Very excited with that. Thank you. And then we've got another question for you. What do you think that the structures on the Miami Circle and or the Royal Palm Circle may have looked like?
Well, I think they were circular huts with the straight walls. They had conical roofs made out of thatch. I think it's possible that the center of the thatch roof might have been open to allow fires being built inside the structure so the smoke could escape. There's something similar to those in Cuba. And one of the mysteries that we encountered is as we dug through downtown Miami, we would look for these features, these fire pits for cooking. We never found hardly anything like that. And we finally realized it was because they likely had fire boxes, that they were actually cooking in these fire boxes and then dumping the ashes off the side of the scaffolding off the side of the building. So, so the buildings were functional. They probably had some kind of open door facing the prevailing winds. You know, of course, we don't know, but that's the best interpretation I can provide.
And then you said that there was something online about the Tequesta town to see that.
Well, my impression of what this town looked like based on the post holes we found, if you go in on the internet and look in Venezuela, Orinoco River, Native American villages, you'll see these villages just aligning the water where you could actually slide your canoes underneath or tie them up to the post. And I think it was something similar with these wooden scaffolding or walkways connecting some of the buildings.
Great. And we've got one more question. Were the tribal members enslaved or killed off? I'm assuming they're talking about the Tequestas.
Well, the demise of the Tequesta came as a result of the arrival of Europeans, the Spanish in particular. And the first record is 1513, when Ponce de Leon comes to Biscayne Bay. Santa Maria apparently is the island of Key Biscayne. And on the map, records that were left without any narrative or descriptions that have been preserved, it refers to the mouth of the river as Tequesta with a C. And so that probably was the first visit. But by the time Pedro Menendez came in 1568, He's the founder of St. Augustine, trying to set up a mission and an outpost in Tequesta with great failure. The diseases began to affect the native people here, and certainly by 1763, as a result of diseases and as a result of slave raids coming from an Indian group called the Yamasee from South Carolina, who were allies of the English, started coming to southern Florida and enslaving and capturing Tequesta and Palouse Indians and bringing them to South Carolina to work on indigo plantations. So the last of the Tequesta were decimated by these things, and petition, by this time they were allies of the Spanish, petitioned the governor of Cuba to allow them to go to Cuba and be resettled there to protect them from the slave raids. That started in 1709. And I had the great honor of joining a Cuban archaeologist about 3 years ago in Cuba, looking at the town that was set up before the Tequesta called Guanabacoa and outside of Havana. And we actually found a South Florida artifact in our excavations there.
So, Bob, I have a question. You mentioned Key Biscayne, and I've trudged around the island, and there are in the park area, in the I guess the center part of the island, or towards the middle of the island, these mounds on that nature trail. And I'm wondering, has anyone done any extensive excavation or any excavation on Key Biscayne, and how heavily or was it settled?
Well, Key Biscayne was very important for Native people, and unfortunately, not much of the site or sites that were there were destroyed as part of the erosion of the tremendous currents on the south end of the island. But when I was the county archaeologist, I documented many sites that were there. They're still there on both the north side of the island as well as on the south side near the lighthouse. But interestingly enough, the elevations you see through most of Key Biscayne in Bill Baggs Park are affected by fill. So under the fill, I'm sure there are more sites, but where all the cars park, where the roads are, everything is under fill. So very little of the original contours of the site are exposed.
Can you walk around and see these mounds? Are they protected? Are they marked?
Well, there's no mounds left. There are midden areas, there are mortuary areas. They're protected because they're in a state park. Mm-hmm. And some of the sites are in county parks and at least in theory also protected. But sometimes government is a worse protector of history than the private sector. You know, you never know what's going to happen.
What they're going to do.
Well, I love that that part about how the construction actually preserved some of the sites. That was interesting.
Yeah, I mean, think of it this way: the site of Met Square, the three, it's actually 4 parking lots were all part of the Royal Palm Hotel, assembled by Flagler. You know, very, very wealthy guy, and the Flagler Corporation was able to maintain that property as this passive parking lot through the 1950s, even though Miami was booming. You know what? The money just wasn't that important at that time. And then look at the Deering Estate, assembled as a result of Danielson, McCormick monies. There's, you know, some of the best land in America is a result of rich people assembling lands for personal pleasure and reasons. So we have to, you know, always keep that in mind.
And we have not a question, but a comment. Please keep these webinars coming. This is just incredible. What a wonderful learning experience. Awesome. And in that note, I was wondering, Bob, how would somebody keep up with what you're doing in the future?
Well, we have a website, the Archaeological Historical Conservancy. It's being redone right now. It's going to be ready in about 2 weeks. We're going to try to keep things up to date and what is being found. We're going to be showing new discoveries and things of that nature. If anybody's interested in volunteering, they can go to our website, let us know that they're interested. We might have something you can help us with.
And where exactly are you working now?
Well, the big project is in downtown Miami.
Downtown.
But we're also working in Jupiter at the Jupiter Lighthouse, and we're doing work in other parts in Palm Beach Island. So we've got several different projects going on.
Oh, cool. I'm excited, and I'm very excited for your new website. Okay, so do we have any more questions from Carol or Arthur? Or the audience?
So I'm going to ask the question, what is it that people think about the Miami Circle now? After all the controversy, it is, it isn't, has that all settled down and the accepted understanding is what you just described to us?
Absolutely. So any archaeologist you speak to, most any will across North America is familiar with the Miami Circle, and they all acknowledge as a result of the science that was done there that was quite definitive with geologists, with archaeologists, with different specialists, that the circle does have antiquity, that is significant. It's a national landmark. That couldn't happen if there was any cloud of doubt about it. So it is pretty well settled. I think people are unhappy in terms of the fact that it is just not well interpreted. It's become essentially a dog park.
Yeah.
It just needs a level of care and curation it just hasn't been getting.
True.
So for those asking for Bob's website, unfortunately, I can't post it into the chat because we're on a webinar, but I will, this will be posted with all the other A River Runs Through It series recordings. And what I'll do is I'll email all attendees with the recording, and I can include Bob Carr's website as well in that, and the Kislak website section of the Mode MDC. Oh, we got way more questions. Cool. Okay, so will AHC resume posting content on Facebook in addition to the updated website?
Yes, we do have a Facebook page. We haven't been very active with it, but that is part of the plan. We're actually working with a couple of people who are experts on social media, so we're going to have more of a presence soon. Awesome.
Yeah, it's a core foundation of the communication nowadays is the Facebook and the okay, so what are your thoughts with the value of these areas and the effects of climate change?
Well, that's an interesting question. You know, climate change is frankly an ongoing process, because if you're an archaeologist, you're looking back at the Paleo-Indian period, at the fact that Biscayne Bay was uplands 10,000 years ago, 12,000 years ago. So this climate change has been an ongoing process. The only difference now is that it's quite accelerated. So we've seen evidence of this in our archaeological findings. We have found portions of sites on the shores of Biscayne Bay with charcoal hearths buried underneath the wet sediments. So, and they dated from 500 BC. So we know there's been at least 3 feet of water coming in since 500 BC. But as the effects of climate change continue, the worst impacts in terms of archaeological sites will be on the barrier islands because of the erosion created by the new interfaces of the beach that will start eroding away. This is already happening all over the eastern part of North America, and that will continue and accelerate. Sites like the Miami River sites, frankly, will probably just go underwater, and these sites will become underwater sites. I don't think they'll be destroyed. They'll just be inaccessible, but I think people will have bigger fish to fry by that time.
I did find out we could post your website.
Okay, good.
So it was Archaeology.
Archaeological, well, it's AR, I can't remember the acronym. It's Archaeological and Historical Conservancy Search. We'll bring it right up though.
We'll give it to you guys. I found it. Okay, let's see if there's more questions. Just more thank yous. Thank you guys. I'm so happy. This is a great event. And I just want to thank Bob for his lifetime of dedication to saving and preserving our history.
All right, thank you.
Very good. Okay, so if we all can, I think I have Wrong website. It's not flaarchaeology.com, is it, Bob?
Say it again.
Is it flaarchaeology.com?
No, that's not it.
Okay.
Do you know what it is?
AHC.
It's AHC. She's I'm getting it looked up here as we're speaking.
I gotta like you on Facebook.
Yeah, we have a Facebook page. You know, you got to keep in mind that some of us, like myself, we're actually computer dinosaurs, so we're not on the cutting edge of social media.
You're out on the fields. You're out on the field.
Yeah.
You certainly have modern technology out there, and the amazing images that you have, the way you can image a site. Where we can even on the monitor really get a sense of the spatial relationships because of the kinds of technologies you can employ today.
Yeah.
Pretty amazing and very informative.
Yeah. Well, yeah, that's true. Let's see. Yeah, that's it. So,
Oh, and I'd just like to announce to everybody while we figure out the website really quick. Our next talk is going to be on October 20th at the same time, and it's going to be A River Runs Through It Part 3, the Seminoles Trade on the River. And this time we're going to be featuring the moderator, Tara Chadwick. Tara Chadwick is the curator of History Fort Lauderdale, and Gordon Wareham. Gordon is the director of the Seminole Tribal Museum. That would be very interesting as well. Oh, I think, is this it? FloridaArchaeology.org. No, I think
yeah, that's it. Florida-archaeology.org.
Thank you, Josh. Thank you so much. So for anybody that asked, we've got it. It's Florida-archaeology.org.
Right.
To keep up with Bob Carr. Okay, everyone. So thank you so much for joining us tonight. I think we've got to everything here. Thank you, Carol. Thank you, Bob Carr. Thank you, Arthur. And yeah, we just got a few weeks till our next one on October 20th.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you, everyone. Enjoyed it.
Thank you, guys. I hope you guys all have a great night and see you next time.